"You're working late again?" Greg called from the kitchen, his tone dripping with fake concern. I glanced up from my laptop, masking the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Big deadlines this week," I said casually. He smirked, pouring himself a glass of wine. "You've got to take it easy, Holly. Life isn't just about work, you know." If only he knew. My name is Holly, and for the last 6 months I've been living a double life. Not the glamorous, exciting kind. No, my double life consisted of pretending everything was fine while quietly piecing together evidence of my husband's betrayal. It started with small things: late-night meetings that didn't make sense, charges on our credit card for expensive restaurants I hadn't visited, and a faint whiff of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but one day, while organizing the mail, I found a receipt for a down payment on a car. A luxury car. That wasn't for me. I confronted him lightly at first, asking about the unusual expenses. Greg, ever the smooth talker, waved it off. "Work perks," he'd said with a grin. "You know how my clients like to celebrate." I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he avoided my eyes told me the truth was far less innocent. So, I started paying attention. It didn't take long to uncover the full picture. Greg wasn't just cheating. He was using our shared savings to fund a lifestyle for Melanie, his so-called client. Expensive dinners, shopping sprees, and the pièce de résistance, the car he planned to present to her as an anniversary gift. The audacity of it all was breathtaking. Here I was, working late nights to secure our future, while he drained our accounts to impress a woman who probably couldn't spell commitment if her life depended on it. But instead of confronting him, I stayed quiet. That night, as Greg settled onto the couch, I opened my laptop and began to plan. I researched fraud reporting procedures, legal options, and even looked up repossession companies. Every keystroke was fueled by a determination I hadn't felt in years. Greg thought he was clever, but he didn't realize he'd underestimated me. If he wanted to play dirty, I was ready to clean house. For the next few weeks, I played my part perfectly. I laughed at Greg's jokes, asked about his business trips, and even pretended not to notice when he'd come home smelling like an overpriced cologne I didn't buy for him. But behind the scenes, I was building my case. The first step was filing a fraud report. The car was purchased with our joint funds, but the dealership papers only had Greg's name on them, a detail I used to my advantage. I contacted the dealership under the guise of needing more information about the transaction. By the time I hung up, I had everything I needed: dates, amounts, and proof that the purchase had been made without my consent. I followed that up with a call to the bank. "I believe my account has been compromised," I told the fraud department. "There's a transaction I didn't authorize, and it's a significant amount." They flagged the account and opened an investigation. Every step I took tightened the noose around Greg's scheme. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on him. Every time he smirked over his phone or whispered into it like a teenager sneaking a call, I took mental notes. I even managed to catch a glimpse of a text from Melanie. "Can't wait to see the surprise you promised." The surprise? The car, no doubt. The thought made my stomach turn, but it also fueled my resolve. Greg thought he was the master manipulator, but he'd forgotten one crucial thing. I knew how to wait. The anniversary plans came together almost too perfectly. Greg suggested a fancy dinner at one of the restaurants he loved to frequent with Melanie. "I want to treat you right," he'd said, flashing a grin that once made me swoon, but now only made my skin crawl. "Sounds wonderful," I replied, masking my contempt with a sweet smile. I knew what he was doing, using the dinner as a cover to present Melanie with the car afterward, but I wasn't about to let him get away with it. That night, after Greg left for another client meeting, I finalized the details with the fraud investigator. The car's purchase was flagged, and the repossession team was scheduled. Everything was set to unfold just as Greg thought he was winning. As I closed my laptop, I felt a strange sense of calm. For weeks, I'd been quietly carrying the weight of his betrayal, pretending not to notice the lies piling up around me. But now, the power had shifted. Greg had no idea his world was about to collapse. The night of our anniversary dinner arrived, and Greg was in his element. He strolled into the house wearing a sharp suit, holding a bouquet of roses and a bottle of champagne. "Happy anniversary, babe," he said with a grin, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Happy anniversary," I replied, my voice steady, my smile practiced. If he noticed the stiffness in my demeanor, he didn't show it. He was too busy gloating. At the restaurant, Greg spared no expense. He ordered the finest wine, the most extravagant dishes, and even arranged for a pianist to play our song. It would have been romantic if I hadn't known the truth. As he sipped his wine, Greg's phone buzzed. His expression lit up when he read the message, though he quickly tried to mask it. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning curiosity. "Just a work thing," he said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Nothing to worry about." I nodded, biting back a smile. I knew exactly what the message said. Melanie was waiting for her surprise. After dinner, Greg suggested we take a walk. "It's such a beautiful night," he said, slipping his arm around my shoulders. I played along, letting him lead me back to the car. He opened the passenger door for me like the perfect gentleman, but I could see the excitement in his eyes. He was counting the minutes until he could ditch me and deliver his grand gesture to Melanie. Back at the house, I watched Greg check his watch repeatedly, his impatience barely concealed. "I've got to run out for a bit," he said finally, his tone casual. "Work emergency." "On our anniversary?" I asked, tilting my head innocently. "It won't take long," he assured me. "Just something I need to handle." I smiled sweetly. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." As he grabbed the keys and headed out the door, I sat back on the couch, my heart pounding. I could imagine the scene unfolding already. Greg pulling up to Melanie's place, handing her the keys and basking in her adoration, until the repossession team arrived. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Ruiz. Repossession complete. Everything went as planned. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over me. Greg had no idea yet, but his perfect little charade had just come crashing down. And this time, I wasn't the one left picking up the pieces. When Greg returned later that night, his face was flushed, and his usual swagger was noticeably absent. He slammed the front door harder than necessary, his keys clinking loudly as he tossed them on the counter. "Rough night?" I asked, glancing up from the book I was pretending to read. He shot me a look, but his words were measured. "Just some unexpected complications," he said, pulling at the knot of his tie. "Anything I can help with?" I asked, my voice dripping with feigned concern. "No," he snapped, then quickly softened his tone. "I mean, it's fine. Nothing for you to worry about." I bit back a smirk and returned to my book, letting the silence stretch between us. Watching Greg squirm was almost too satisfying, but I wasn't done yet. As he disappeared into the bedroom, muttering something about needing to figure things out, I received another text from Detective Ruiz. "Your husband filed a report with the dealership. Claimed the car was taken by mistake. We'll keep you updated." I chuckled softly, imagining Greg's humiliation as he tried to explain the repossession without revealing the fraud. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Greg pacing in the kitchen. He was on the phone, his voice low and tense. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying. "Just fix it. She's furious, and I can't—" He stopped abruptly when he noticed me standing in the doorway. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He forced a smile. "Morning. Just handling some work stuff." "Sounds stressful," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "Anything I should know about?" "No," he said quickly, his tone clipped. "Nothing you need to worry about." For the rest of the day, Greg was uncharacteristically quiet. He spent hours on his laptop, muttering under his breath and occasionally slamming the lid shut in frustration. I could tell he was trying to salvage the situation, but there was nothing he could do. The fraud report had triggered a full investigation, and the dealership wasn't about to hand the car back without answers. By the evening, Greg's patience had worn thin. "Do you ever feel like the universe is just out to get you?" he asked suddenly, his tone bitter. "Sometimes," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. "But I think the universe has a way of balancing things out, don't you?" He didn't respond, but the look he gave me lingered a little too long, as if he suspected I knew more than I let on. The cracks in Greg's composure grew more obvious by the day. He was short-tempered, distracted, and constantly on the phone, arguing with someone on the other end. I didn't press him. Instead, I watched and waited, silently enjoying the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade. One evening, I overheard a particularly heated call. Greg was pacing in the living room, his voice low but furious. "I told you I'd fix it," he hissed. "Just give me a little more time. It's not my fault. These things happen." I could guess who he was talking to. Melanie. I leaned against the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through my phone, though every fiber of my being was focused on his words. "She's overreacting," Greg muttered, clearly trying to calm whoever was on the other end. "You don't need to make this a big deal. I'll sort it out." The call ended abruptly, and Greg threw his phone onto the couch, muttering a string of curses. "Everything okay?" I asked, stepping into the living room with feigned innocence. He looked up, startled, then forced a tight smile. "Yeah, just work stuff." "Must be tough," I said, sitting down across from him. "You've been so stressed lately. Are you sure there's nothing I can do to help?" His jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "No, I've got it under control." That night, I received another update from Detective Ruiz. "The investigation is moving forward. The dealership has corroborated the fraud report. Your husband's activity is under review." I stared at the message, a mix of relief and anticipation coursing through me. The net was closing in, and Greg had no idea. The next morning, Greg's mood hit a new low. He sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, barely touching his coffee. "I don't know what's wrong with people these days," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Everyone's out for themselves." I almost choked on my coffee but managed to stifle a laugh. "Really? What happened?" He waved his hand dismissively. "Just some setbacks. Nothing for you to worry about." "Of course," I said sweetly, hiding my smirk behind the rim of my mug. By the end of the week, Greg was visibly unraveling. His confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a man grasping at straws. As he sat in the living room that evening, typing furiously on his laptop, I leaned against the doorway. "You know, Greg," I said casually, "sometimes people get exactly what they deserve." He froze for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before turning to look at me. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged, my expression calm. "Just something to think about." The breaking point came on a Saturday evening. Greg had been on edge all day, snapping at everything and everyone. By the time he got a call from Melanie, his carefully maintained mask shattered entirely. I was in the kitchen when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, cursed under his breath, and walked outside to take the call. Curious, I followed quietly, staying just out of sight by the open window. "You don't understand," Greg hissed, his voice frantic. "It's not my fault. The dealership's claiming fraud, but I didn't—" He paused, clearly interrupted by a furious tirade on the other end. "I told you I'd fix it," he said, his voice cracking. "Do you think I like this any more than you do? Just give me a little more time, Melanie." Her voice was muffled, but her anger was unmistakable. When he finally hung up, Greg stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. "Everything okay?" I asked innocently, glancing up from my laptop as he stormed past. "Fine," he snapped, disappearing into the bedroom. Moments later, I heard the unmistakable sound of drawers being yanked open and slammed shut. Curious, I peeked into the room and found him frantically rummaging through his closet, throwing clothes and shoes onto the bed. "What are you doing?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Packing," he said shortly. "Packing?" I raised an eyebrow. "Are you going somewhere?" Don't start, Holly, he said, his voice tight. I don't have time for this right now. I crossed my arms, watching as he stuffed random items into a duffel bag. What's going on, Greg? You've been acting strange all week. He froze for a moment, his back to me, before turning around. It's nothing, he said, his tone sharper than usual. Just a work emergency I need to deal with. I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably long. Finally, I smiled. If you say so. As Greg left with his hastily packed bag, I received a text from Detective Ruiz. The investigation is moving fast. Expect more developments soon. I sat on the couch, staring at the door Greg had just walked through, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. He thought he was running to fix things, but the truth was, there was nothing left to fix. By the time he realized it, it would be too late. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax. The plan was in motion, and the pieces were falling into place. All I had to do now was wait. And if there was one thing I'd learned over the years, it was how to wait. Monday morning, I woke to a string of missed calls and frantic voicemails from Greg. Holly, call me back, it's urgent. Where are you? I need to talk to you now. They're saying fraud, but it's not true. You've got to help me fix this. I deleted each one without hesitation, savoring the quiet triumph of knowing the tables had finally turned. Over coffee, I texted Detective Ruiz for an update. His reply was swift. Greg tried to contact the dealership this morning. He's panicking, but the fraud investigation has progressed too far for him to undo anything. I smiled to myself, imagining Greg's face as he realized there was no way out. Around midday, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Greg stood on the porch looking disheveled and desperate. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, and his usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. We need to talk, he said, his tone pleading. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. Talk about what, Greg? The car you bought for your mistress, or the fraud charges you're facing? His eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. Holly, I can explain. No need, I cut him off. I know everything. The fake business trips, the luxury dinners, the car. You thought I wouldn't notice, but I've known for months. He stumbled over his words, trying to piece together a defense, but I didn't give him the chance. You used our money to fund your lies, I said, my voice steady. You betrayed me, and now you're paying the price. He stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Holly, please. I messed up, but we can fix this. I'll pay you back. I'll do whatever it takes. I raised an eyebrow. You'll pay me back? With what? Your empty promises or the love letters from Melanie? The mention of her name made him flinch, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. Before he could respond, I stepped back and gestured to the stack of papers sitting on the entryway table. You can start by signing these, I said. Greg hesitated, glancing at the documents. What is this? Divorce papers, I replied. You've already lost the car, and soon you'll lose access to everything else. Consider this your final chance to walk away with whatever dignity you have left. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. For a moment I thought he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. You don't have to do this, he said weakly. Yes, I do, I said firmly. Because unlike you, I know how to finish what I start. Greg left without another word, and as I closed the door behind him, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The man who had taken so much from me was finally out of my life, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The house felt eerily quiet after Greg left, but it wasn't the unsettling kind of silence I'd grown used to during our marriage. This was the peaceful kind, the kind that meant freedom. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the signed divorce papers. Greg had left reluctantly, his pleas still echoing in my mind, but the weight of his betrayal no longer sat heavy on my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt in control. Over the next few days, I started putting my life back together piece by piece. The first step was meeting with my lawyer to finalize the divorce. Clara, ever efficient, was thrilled with how smoothly things were progressing. With the fraud investigation and the financial evidence we've gathered, he doesn't have much leverage, Clara said, flipping through her notes. You'll keep the house, your assets, and any remaining funds he hasn't squandered. And what about the fraud case? I asked, my voice steady but curious. That's moving forward as well, Clara replied. Detective Ruiz has ensured that all the pieces are in place. Greg will be facing charges soon, and given the evidence, it's unlikely he'll avoid jail time. I nodded, the news giving me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. While the legal battles moved forward, I focused on reclaiming the space Greg had tried to overshadow. I rearranged the furniture, replaced the old curtains with ones I'd picked out, and even painted the living room a soft shade of blue, my favorite color, not his. Amanda came over one afternoon to help, armed with paint rollers and a bottle of wine. This place already feels different, she said as we worked. It's like you've taken back the energy he tried to drain from it. That's the goal, I replied with a smile. I want this house to feel like mine, not a reminder of him. I also started reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Greg had always insisted on controlling our social life, dictating who we spent time with and when. Now, I was free to make my own choices. One evening, I hosted a small dinner party with Amanda and a few close friends. As we laughed and shared stories over a meal I'd cooked myself, I realized how much I'd missed this, being surrounded by people who truly cared about me, not the version of me Greg had tried to shape. The investigation into Greg's fraud continued to make progress. Detective Ruiz called me with updates every few days, his tone always professional but tinged with satisfaction. The dealership is cooperating fully, he said during one call. Greg's attempts to cover his tracks only made things worse for him. It's a matter of time before we see this through. I thanked him, feeling a mix of relief and validation. Greg had spent years trying to manipulate me, but in the end, he'd only outsmarted himself. As I hung up the phone, I stood in the middle of my freshly painted living room, taking it all in. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like home. The weeks after Greg's departure brought a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house, once filled with tension and lies, now felt like a sanctuary. One morning, as I sat on the back porch sipping coffee, I opened my notebook and started jotting down plans for the future. For so long, my life had revolved around keeping Greg happy, balancing his whims and smoothing over his mistakes. Now, for the first time, I could focus entirely on myself. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Things I've always wanted to do." The list grew quickly. Redecorate the house, travel to Greece, start my own business, spend more time with friends and family. Each item felt like a step toward reclaiming my identity, one that had been overshadowed by Greg's selfishness for too long. I started small, tackling the first item on the list. With Amanda's help, I transformed the house into a reflection of my style, warm, inviting, and unapologetically mine. We painted the walls in vibrant colors, replaced the furniture Greg had insisted on, and even turned his old home office into an art studio. "This feels like you," Amanda said as we hung a large painting on the living room wall. "It's like the house finally matches the person living in it." I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. It's a work in progress, but it's getting there. The next step was rebuilding my career. During my marriage, Greg had discouraged me from pursuing my professional goals, insisting that his ambitions were more important. Now, I was determined to make up for lost time. I reached out to old colleagues and mentors, explaining my situation and expressing my interest in re-entering the workforce. Their support was overwhelming, and within weeks, I had several promising opportunities lined up. One evening, I received a call from a former boss who offered me a consulting position on a project I was passionate about. "We'd love to have you back," she said warmly. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a sense of validation I hadn't realized I needed. "I'm ready." As I settled into my new routine, I began to notice subtle but significant changes in myself. I was more confident, more decisive, and more willing to take risks. The fear and self-doubt that Greg had instilled in me were fading, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, I looked around the house and smiled. This was my life now, messy, imperfect, and entirely my own. A few weeks later, I received a call from Detective Ruiz. "The fraud investigation is officially complete," he said. "Greg has been formally charged and the case will proceed to court in a few months." The news hit me harder than I expected, not because I felt sorry for Greg, but because it symbolized the final unraveling of the life we'd once shared. "Thank you for everything," I told Ruiz, meaning it. Without his guidance, I wasn't sure I would have had the strength to see this through. "Justice takes time," he said simply, "but it's worth it." That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch, staring up at the stars. The closure I'd been waiting for was finally within reach, and with it came a strange mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a touch of sadness for the life I'd thought I'd have. Amanda came over the next day, her usual energy filling the house. "You look different," she said, handing me a bag of takeout. Like a weight's been lifted. "Maybe it has," I replied with a small smile. "Greg's charges are moving forward, and the divorce is almost finalized. It feels like I can finally breathe again." Amanda grinned. "You're practically glowing. What's next?" I gestured to the notebook on the coffee table. "I've been making plans. Travel, work, maybe even a business of my own. I'm finally figuring out what I want, instead of what someone else expects of me." "About time," Amanda teased, raising her glass in a toast. "Here's to the next chapter." No. In the weeks that followed, I started checking more items off my list. I booked a solo trip to Greece, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the freedom to pursue. The thought of exploring ancient ruins and walking along sunlit beaches filled me with a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. At the same time, I dove into my consulting work with enthusiasm, reconnecting with the passion and drive that Greg had tried to stifle. Every step forward felt like a declaration. I was no longer defined by the mistakes of my past or the betrayal I'd endured. One afternoon, as I stood in my freshly redecorated living room, I glanced at the framed photo on the mantel. It was a picture of me and Amanda from years ago, taken long before Greg had entered my life. Looking at it now, I realized something important. I was still that person, the strong, capable woman who knew how to stand on her own 2 feet. Greg hadn't taken that from me, no matter how hard he'd tried. And now I was finally ready to move forward without looking back.